Welcome back to Roots Music History. On the last episode, we talked about Leo Fender and everything from Leo Fender's childhood through how he built the Fender empire. There were two very important men I did not mention in the Fender documentary, and I did that on purpose because I really thought they deserved their own Roots rockumentaries. And the next video I was going to make was going to be focused on the Music Man amplifiers. However, through all of my research and conversations, I realized the story of how Forrest White even became involved in Fender in the first place, and Forrest White's journey working with Leo Fender, that holds so much weight to the story and is really important to know and to understand before we talk about the Music Man amps. So for that reason, this episode is going to be all about how Forrest White, the man who ultimately teamed up with Tom Walker, met Leo Fender and about his journey working with Fender instruments. But the Music Man amps mean so much more to people than just a good quality amplifier. They are also one of the last bits of music history the world got from Leo Fender, from his brain. Now, all of this, albeit in a very quiet and silent manner, which makes for a spectacular story. In order to appreciate how Forrest White really came into Leo Fender's life, I highly recommend you watch my first video on the history of Leo Fender. Even though I don't specifically talk about Forrest White in that documentary, I take you through Leo Fender's journey from childhood all the way through 1965 when Fender was built, or when Fender was bought by CBS. So it's important to know all of the facets of Leo's life and career hurdles so that when I mention them in this video, they hold a greater weight. So I'm going to link that video in the description down below and in the corner. It will also be on the end screen of this video. If you want to watch this video first and then watch the first one, that would work too, but I just highly recommend watching both. And like I said, there were two men I intentionally left out of that episode because I knew I would be making a follow-up, and now I know I am making two follow-ups. So when you watch that first episode of Leo Fender, you will know it was around 1947 when Leo started really butting heads with his distributor. He was feeling like he was really starting to reach rock bottom in his business. And it was in Leo Fender's lowest moments in his business endeavor that one of the most important people came into his life. Forrest White was born in 1920, so he would have been 11 years younger than Leo Fender. Forrest worked as an engineer in his 20s at Goodyear Aircraft in Akron, Ohio. After working there a few years, Goodyear paid to send him from Ohio to LA. His purpose there was to begin writing procedure for building the tail section of the Lockheed P-38 fighter plane. No big deal, just the coolest job in the world. Along with Forrest's love of aviation, Forrest also loved music and the anatomy of guitars. In 1948, he decided to take a stab at building his own solid body guitar, and he was pretty happy with it, but he always felt like he could have done a better job. So anytime Forrest would go to a show, he'd always be looking at the musicians' instruments, trying to remember the technicalities he saw and to observe how they were plugging everything in and how they were using everything. He was listening to their sound and the tone and everything, trying to absorb all of the information that he could about instrument building. So one day, he comes back to Ohio from his job in LA to see a few of his friends play a show. There was a guy playing that night named Bob Foster. Bob was playing a steel guitar with a band called the Cowboy Copas, and Forrest remembers the sound of this steel guitar was unlike anything he had heard. He knew that if he could figure out what Bob was doing with his setup, he could possibly replicate that with the guitar he had built for himself. So after the show, he went backstage and literally just walked up to Bob and asked him what that was, what he was using. And Bob told Forrest it was all Fender. And Forrest was like, Fender? I've never heard of Fender. Bob told Forrest that Fender was located out of California and that they were making the best stuff. Forrest was so impressed with this sound that when he flew back to California, one of the very first things he did was look up Leo Fender's address and go to his shop to meet him. Forrest brought with him to Leo Fender's shop his solid body guitar, which was a 10-string, like I said, that he had put together himself. Leo Fender was very impressed with this 10-string guitar, and Forrest was even more impressed with Leo Fender. And the two of them instantly hit it off. After Forrest finished his work on the fighter jet in LA, he had to fly back to Ohio. Honestly, he never really thought anything of that meeting with Leo Fender other other than the fact it was just a really fun afternoon that he had talking to a really cool person. Now, 2 years after this encounter, Forrest is still in Ohio, and Leo now, arguably out of desperation for money and fear of failure, had officially invented and patented his Broadcaster and Esquire designs. And Leo was working very hard to sell these very first prototypes to gather enough money to invest in the machinery to go full production on them. Then in 1951, Leo officially incorporated himself as Fender Electric Instrument Company, and it's that same year that Forrest White moves from Ohio to California permanently. Forrest didn't move to California with any intention to work with Leo or work in music at all. He actually moved to California because he got a job as an industrial engineer in Riverside. Riverside, California is about a 40-minute drive to Anaheim, where Leo's manufacturing site was. And just to prove what an afterthought Leo Fender was for Forrest White, it was 3 whole years after he moved to California that he decided one day to just randomly call up that guy, Leo Fender, and see if he remembered him and if he wanted to have lunch. Now, the two men hadn't seen each other since 1948. And Leo was in a much different place now than he was then. Now it's the spring of 1954. And again, you have to watch that first video to fully appreciate the timeline here. But in 1948, Leo had a ton of debt to Francis Hall. He did not have these new prototypes. He did not have these new designs. He was really concerned about the future of his business. He had just parted ways with his first business partner. He was very lost in 1948 when he initially met Forrest White, and Forrest White had no idea. He thought Leo was the coolest person and the shop was the best place on earth. And now it's 1954, and even though Leo now had his patents, he now had these new designs, he had demand unlike anything he had ever seen before, he was still struggling in the sense that he was trying to manage all this growth. So Leo gets this call from Forrest White and agrees to have lunch with him. And this is one of the most incredible moments in music history to me because the serendipitous timing of Forrest White moving to Riverside in the same year Fender incorporates, and then 3 years later, randomly calling Leo for a random lunch at a time that Leo had just had a discussion with his other colleague, George Fullerton, and his other colleague, Freddie. And it was actually Freddie who was telling Leo, you are not doing well. I know you have a really good design. You have these really good prototypes. You have a lot of demand, but you're going to go under if you don't do something. And he had just had that conversation with Freddie. He had just sat down with Freddie and said, Freddie, what do we do? We've got to do something. I agree. And Freddie said, you've got to bring someone in from the outside, someone who has actual manufacturing experience. So Leo and Freddie were just talking about this when, as we call it on Roots Music History, divine music intervention strikes and Forrest White calls up Leo for this lunch. Which, by the way, you can purchase some Divine Music Intervention merchandise and other Roots Music History merchandise on the Spread Shop store, which I am linking in the description down below. And I'm also tagging a few products to the video so that you can check it out and see if you like anything. Leo looks at Forrest in the middle of this lunch and says, would you be interested in taking over the operations of the plant? Now, at this point in time, Forrest had been with his company in Riverside, California for about 3 years. And he had a really good job there with a steady salary. So he wasn't very quick to say yes. Forrest said maybe. He said he'd look at their current operations and make a decision based off of that. And Leo says okay. So they schedule a time and Forrest comes back and he's looking at the Fender manufacturing plant. He's looking at how they're currently operating and it's a complete mess. It's a total mess. But to Leo's defense, he did not have experience in manufacturing. He was an accountant before all of this. Now for Forrest, he's coming from a manufacturing background where you have very strict flowcharts and procedures. But over at Fender's manufacturing facility, everything was, as Forrest White would describe, as a free-for-all. someone would be doing some work on a guitar right next to somebody else who was doing work on an amplifier. One person would set down a tool for the guitar right next to the tools for the amps, and everything was just scattered all over the place. The workbenches were messy. Nothing made sense. So Forrest turns to Leo Fender and says, I would be willing to help you out. He said, I will leave my job in Riverside, California, and I'll come here and take over this role under one condition. I have to have a free hand. I have to be able to make decisions, have the authority to make decisions. And if I see something that needs improvement, I need to be able to act on that and to change that without any roadblocks or red tape from you. And Leo said, that's completely fine. And he handed over to Forrest 100% of the operations. Now, from the very beginning, Forrest saw how particular Leo Fender was and how difficult it was for Leo to hand over all of this to one person he didn't know that well. You know, Leo had been burned multiple times in this industry and in his career path. I go into all of that, obviously, more in depth in the Leo Fender documentary, but all the way down to the smallest things. For example, when Forrest first came in to start working, he wanted a coat hook. He just wanted like a 2x4 piece of wood that he could put on the wall and put some coat hooks on. And Leo was like, I don't know, maybe we can do that. I don't think I'm gonna have time for it though. I don't think it's a good idea. Let's focus on other things. And Forrest was like, why? What do you mean you don't trust me to put up a board with hooks? And he was like, look, my dad builds houses. I've helped him build houses. I have a construction background too. Like, I don't think I can mess this up. It's a board with hooks. But apparently there was just a little bit of a kerfuffle with Leo Fender on putting up a board with hooks for their coats. So little things like that would honestly bleed into every other aspect too. But Leo knew how badly he needed Forrest. He knew if he didn't bring Forrest on board, if he didn't give Forrest full authority to make these decisions, his company was not going to grow. It was never going to get there unless he had the help of someone else. And Forrest was the perfect person for this role. And Leo knew that. And of course, this new opportunity was daunting for Forrest, but this new opportunity also meant that Forrest would have the ability to make this place his own. When Forrest started at Fender Instruments in May of 1954, there were only about 40 employees there. The Stratocaster had just been designed, but there was no production on it yet, so all they really had was the Broadcaster model, which eventually became the Telecaster, and the Esquire. They also had a bass guitar and some steels as well, but primarily their babies and their pride and joys were those Broadcasters and Esquires. Now, the very first change Forrest made at the Fender plant was separating out the guitar production from the amp production. He also, and this is very important, he changed the incentive plan for the employees. Before Forrest came on board, the pay structure was set in a way where it would behoove the employees to turn over more instruments in a shorter period of time. And there was no quality control or incentive to spend time focusing on the quality itself. So by changing the pay structure and incentivizing better quality instruments be produced, the returns on the instruments started to decrease drastically, as did the need for any instrument repairs. And this helped Fender really gain the trust of their customers. Folks started talking around their networks about the high quality instruments that were now coming out of the Fender manufacturing plant. It's important to note though that musicians were loving the new designs, okay? They loved the stability of the Fender neck. And again, you've got to watch that first episode to really be following, but they loved the stability of the Fender neck. They loved the truss rod. They loved the fact that they could easily disassemble the neck and make repairs or modifications. But the dealers, the people who were buying and selling these guitars, were brutal. In fact, one dealer at the guitar show in Chicago that year called their design a, quote, toilet seat with strings. But Fender believed in their cause, and they did not cease operations just because a few dealers were bad-mouthing them. And of course, they didn't have any sophisticated tools. They did not have expensive production equipment. Most of what they were doing, actually all of what they were doing, was by hand, one by one. But Leo Fender was, in the words of Forrest White, exactly, quote, smart as a tack. And Leo Fender knew how to use what products they had to make the best quality product possible. Now, while Forrest was able to make these big strides and improvements in the plant operations, he faced one major hurdle on a daily basis. He had zero insight into the inventory that Fender had on hand. And not only that, but he also had zero insight into what parts were currently on back order. Forrest would go to Don Randall, who was the head of the distributor with Fender at the time. Again, first episode, folks, but he would go to Don Randall and say, I need to know what inventory we have. I need to know what's on back order because I need to make the operations around what we have. Obviously, you don't need to be in manufacturing. You don't need a degree in any of this to know if you're running operations on a manufacturing plant. One key piece of information is what you're going to be manufacturing based off of what parts you have. So just one minor detail here that Forrest could not get. He went to Don Randall and he said, can you give me this information? And Don Randall said to him, quote, it's none of your business. And that is not to paint the picture of Don Randall being a bad guy. In fact, Don Randall and Leo and Forrest, they were all friends. They were all friendly. Nobody was an actual enemy to each other, but the business affairs were just extremely chaotic, and each individual's entrepreneurial spirit and personality just made things way more difficult than they needed to be. And it was just little minor things that just threw everything off of whack. You know, and Forrest gave an example. He said, you know, we would be making amps, for example, and Don Randall would order all these parts for the amps. You know, he would order a cover to go on top of the amplifier. And then as soon as the covers would arrive, Leo Fender would have changed something in the design of the amp. And now the covers that Don Randall ordered didn't fit the amps because Leo changed something, didn't tell Don, or he did tell Don, but it was too late. And now you have all these covers and now you have to return them. So that was just the chaos that was going on. And it wasn't because anyone had an evil spirit inside of them. It was just very chaotic. And so then you have Forrest coming and saying, I need to know what we have. I need to know what's going on. And Leo and Don didn't even know what was going on. So they couldn't even tell Forrest what was going on. But despite the chaos here and what could be described as dysfunction, but could also be described as complete genius, despite all of that, the next few years, the Fender brand continued to grow, and the company took on many, many, many more employees, one of which was a man named Tom Walker. And no one knew this at the time, but Tom Walker would end up playing a massive role in the afterlife of all of this. In just over 10 years, by 1965, when CBS came to buy Fender, Fender had over 800 employees, and they were producing around 1,500 guitars per week. After CBS bought Fender, though, everything changed for the worst. The quality went down drastically, to say the least. And even though Forrest stayed with the Fender company through this buyout, he resigned a year later in 1966 after observing the downfall that was occurring under CBS's control. And this left everyone wondering, including Leo and Forrest, if the good quality Fender amps and guitars were going to be gone forever. But would they? Leo Fender had to sign a non-compete agreement, so how could Leo Fender possibly continue making those good quality products after signing this non-compete? Or could he? Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you're notified when I post the video after this all about the afterlife of the Fender instruments, how they live on through the Music Man amplifiers and the Music Man company. And if you like this type of content, you can give me a super thanks as well. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to this channel and to these stories. Your donations are imperative to help the operations of this channel improve and keep going. For example, we are in the process of launching a Roots website. So all of these stories will be available in transcript form, and we're also going to have other facets on the website too, a place for the merchandise store, other things like that. All of the donations and the super things are going towards building that website right now as well, and that would not be possible if it weren't for you guys. So thank you so much for being here and for supporting Roots Music History, and I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedom. freedoms down Liberty Avenue.